Hi, my name is Colin Barrett, and I'm going to read an extract from a short story I'm working on titled A Low, Shimmering Black Drone. The meaning of that title will be apparent from this extract. All you need to know about the story is it concerns a obscure Irish writer living in Toronto who befriends a famous Canadian writer in this year, the year 2020, the year of the pandemic. Nicholas Cable was a famous writer, by which I mean he was famous for a writer. Every writer knew who he was, and perhaps one in every 20 civilians you mentioned his name to might recognize it, though they might not be sure from where. If they did not know his books, they tended to know at least one of the several movies made out of his books. Cable wrote novels, stories, plays, screenplays. He'd been writing for decades. In interviews, he had always accredited his success to a dog-like, indefatigability. Whenever I write a bad book, I write another, and whenever I write a good book, I write another. And by now he'd ascended to that level of success where they stop giving you prizes and start giving you medals, where an embassy might invite you for dinner 12,000 kilometers away because the wife of the ambassador loved your last book. When I first met Caber, he was on the verge of turning 60 and still very handsome. His defining features were, of course, his famous eyes. In real life, the pale-flecked, semi-translucent color of dirty ice, which in his always black and white publicity photos appeared agelessly stark and phosphorescent and seemed to look right out at you as an angel's might. That suggestion of celestial judgment, not a bad trait for a writer to have or appear to have. We were, after all, living in a time when what people wanted from writers was judgment. Cable was tall and even in late middle age, so thin he verged on the gaunt, his suits hanging off him as if his body had survived, but never fully recovered from some formative ravaging, a childhood wasting disease or blood disorder, or just hunger. Cable claimed he'd grown up dirt poor in what he described as a hillbilly town in the middle of nowhere in rural Alberta. His father was a drunk who used to regularly beat him and his siblings with the end of a snapped-off antique chair leg the father had salvaged from a junkyard, so Cable claimed. The chair leg was sort of like a dog's leg, curved to a dainty little claw shape. Cabriole, I believe the style is called. It left what looked like paw prints all up my back, Cable told me once. A detail I subsequently heard him repeat a good dozen times at readings, talks, and in bars. He was, I suppose, proud of how laconic he could be about all that old trauma. I got to know Cable by going to the readings, the talks, and the bars. I had no money, but in the bars I would buy a drink and make it last 2 drinks, staying on even as the crowd thinned out. I watched other people try to ingratiate themselves with Cable. Some came on deferential, and some came on provocative, and they were all a little exhausting to him, I think. Me, I hung back. I said nothing. I had nothing to say. I had a sense somehow that if I stuck around long enough, eventually I would become interesting, something like a puzzle to be solved. The night we became friends, we were drinking with 2 other writers, both of whom Cable already knew. The 2 were a little younger and a lot less famous than Cable. They were performing for him, unleashing one decisive and sweeping opinion after another about art and life and all the rest of it. Now and then one of them would turn to me, bug-eyed, teeth stained blue from the wine Cable was footing the bill for, and hiss, "What do you think?" then swivel away from me before I could even attempt to answer. Not that I ever had an answer. An answer would require an opinion, and I did not have opinions. I was a deadweight, struck dumb on the edge of the conversation. But Cable was not saying much either. He weathered the 2 writers' endless pronouncing with a flat, tolerant smile, and in return offered only morsels of carefully innocuous industry gossip. Cable was famous, which meant he didn't have to say anything, certainly not to these 2. After they left, he asked me what I thought of them. I said nothing, and this nothing, this merciful absence of human noise, pleased him. Cable fixed me with his eyes of bright, dirty ice. "That's my problem," he said to my silence. "I'll put up with anybody." After that, he asked me what part of Ireland I came from. He'd been there many times and loved the place, and I told him the sorry tale of how my father had ended up living out in Alberta. And Cable told me about Alberta and the sorry tale of his father. When the lockdown was first announced and nobody knew for sure how bad things were going to get, Cable did what many people with the means and opportunity did. He headed for the hills. He had a cottage up north. The night before he left, he invited me over for dinner, a habitual assignation of ours. I showed up at his door in a mask and he laughed in my face. We ate shrimp and rice Cable cooked himself, drank 3 bottles of wine out of the cellar. The authorities were already telling people not to travel unnecessarily, which Caber took to mean that if he did not leave right now, he might end up stuck in the city for good. I do think it's an irresponsible, hysterical, and absolutely cowardly thing to do, and I sincerely hope that nobody else but me does it, Caber said. But it can't be helped, and I have a book to finish. There's always a book, I said. There's always a book, Caber said. After dinner, we moved to the sitting room and drank cognac. Buddy, who's a dog, was up on the sofa, tucked right in beside Caber stroking his coat. Even the excitable Linus was down on all fours on the rug in front of the switched-off fireplace, watching something indiscernible through the enormous windows overlooking Caber's floodlit back garden, which to me seemed only empty and still. We talked about it, the virus, the plague. Caber knew doctors, the hospitals anticipating scenarios where they might become overwhelmed, but quietly preparing contingencies and contingencies for the contingencies. Talking about these things made my scalp prickle, like my skin was a piece of fabric and slowly knotted tighter and tighter at the base of my neck. Caber, by contrast, could see something like the funny side of it all, because he was getting to run away and because even a world-stopping virus had brought with it a stroke of good fortune for him. He told me his phone had been going non-stop even more than usual, mainly because of a short, obscure novel he'd written almost 10 years ago called The Low, Shimmering Black Drone, which, with the onset of the pandemic, had lately returned to public attention. The novel begins with the never-named protagonist, a writer, waking up in bed with his wife. They begin groggily talking, the way they always do, as they go through their morning routine. Except the writer notices that every time his wife speaks, he hears in the back of his head a noise he describes as a low, shimmering black drone. The same thing happens when the writer's daughter speaks to him, and later on when he's out in public. Any human voice within earshot triggers this low, shimmering black drone. The writer describes the drone as just loud enough to make communication continuously irritating and clumsy, but not so loud that communication is impossible. Soon other people begin hearing the low, shimmering black drone, and eventually everybody in the world. No explanation or source for the phenomenon can be determined by scientists, or governments, and no solution or even an effective mitigating measure is ever found. Many people take vows of silence, revert to exclusively text-based communication, learn sign language. Laws are put in place prohibiting gatherings that might include public speaking, but as the months and then years grind by with no end in sight, suicide rates, crime, violence, and geopolitical instability surge. At first because of governmental pressure and then of their own volition. People stop going out, they stop interacting, social life evaporates, the world begins to lose its mind. There's the memorably unpleasant, if luridly unsubtle scene at the climax of the book when the writer, barricaded into his soundproof apartment, his wife and daughter are long gone, and half mad with loneliness, savages his eardrums with a fountain pen in an attempt to save himself from ever again being subjected to the drone. The book ends months later with the healing, newly deaf writer restored to a kind of peace, isolated but productive, working on a new book. He got to the end of a sentence. He hit the space key, got to the end of another sentence, and then the next after that. There came the familiar, ecstatic, floating feeling of approaching the end. He wrote another sentence, and it was done. Raw, but done. He looked up. Branches were moving in the breeze outside his apartment window. He watched the leaf detach, flashing silver, as it turned and turned in the air and disappeared from sight. Already that exalted, floating feeling was slipping away. He knew why. And out of the still depths of his self-inflicted silence, he heard it rising toward him again, the low, shimmering black drone. The reviews at the time were tepid and puzzled, most critics interpreting the novel as an overheated and self-indulgent allegory about the struggle of the writer to accommodate himself to the clamor and distraction of the modern world, and asking quite reasonably why anyone who was not a writer would give a shit about such a predicament. But this year, within weeks of the first lockdown's beginning, a Ben Lerner NYR piece about the low shimmering black drone went viral, and shortly after that, a streaming service announced they had bought the rights and were adapting the book into a miniseries. Now journalists were ringing and emailing Caber day and night to ask him how he'd come to write this uncannily prophetic fable about a society struck by a catastrophic exogenous event where everyone ends up sealed inside their homes, deranged and alone. Basically, I just liked the phrase, the low shimmering black drone, and wanted to use it in a book, he said. From that, I spun out this flimsy, clumsy piece of sub-Saramagian bullshit that none of my editors really liked, and actually I didn't even like, but it was done and I needed the money. So we put it out. It dropped off the face of the earth, and I never thought about it again. Until now, I said. Until now, Caber said. What's it feel like to be a prophet? I asked him. I want you to know I have emphatically refuted any charges of prophecy. Good Lord. Imagine claiming someone was a prophet just because they said in the future bad things are going to happen.